Okay, so we are now recording this session. Welcome everybody to the Alberta Centre for Injury Control and Research and the Centre for Suicide Prevention's school webinar, the 5 things we wish all teachers knew about what to do after a suicide. I have just turned the recorder on, so this webinar will be available as a recording within a few days of our presentation here today. As we've already identified, everybody is in audio-only mode except for Dave and myself. So if you have questions or comments, ideas, or things that you want to just bring to other people's attention here in the webinar, please use the chat function in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. I'm Patty Stark with Alberta Centre for Injury Control and Research, and I'm pleased today to present Dave McLeod, who is a clinical psychologist. Dave has worked with both the Calgary Distress Center and is a consulting trainer with the Center for Suicide Prevention. So he's going to talk he's going to give our presentation today, and then at the end there will be an opportunity to answer questions and respond to comments. So Dave, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Patty. Well, and welcome everybody. Good to have all of you visiting with us this afternoon, and from a long ways away. A couple of people even from as far away as New Zealand. Of course, we're based in Calgary, and most of you are from Alberta, but some are from other provinces in Canada as well. So great to have all of you here. And today we're taking on a topic that I guess the ironic thing about this topic is that it would probably be a good thing if this ends up being a huge waste of your time, because we're going to talk about what a school can do after a suicide happens. And so, of course, our hope is that that doesn't ever happen, that you never have to use anything that I talk about today. But it's a good thing to have thought this through before it happens, just in case something does take place. The 5 things that I want to talk about today are 5 principles or ideas or themes that sort of govern or guide us in how we respond. My idea is to put up these 5 ideas first and then walk through an example, a simulation, a pretend what happens if there's been a suicide in your school and what can you do, right from first hearing about it all the way through to trying to resume normal kind of life. And these are themes that, first thing to say is that they're not in order of importance by any means. And that first they start to look a bit like sort of motherhood statements where it's easy to say, yes, of course that makes sense. But one of the things we're going to discover, I think, is that they don't always match up easily with one another, that sometimes they stand in contrast to each other. The challenge here is always to balance our own compassion for a family that have gone through a suicide with the need for the school to represent a place of stability and steadiness. There's a common notion that when a crisis happens, you look to things that are unchanging, that are working, that are stable, to be able to hang on to those. So the first principle that I wrote down was one about resuming normal life as soon as possible. Certainly that's the school's interest, is to try not to compromise the general sort of functioning of the school, to try to stay steady and stable. But the second one, which is every bit as important, is trying to always be mindful of the family of the deceased. Moreover, there are other people that are impacted by this as well. The students and the staff in the school are impacted by it. And a fourth principle is the importance of trying to get ahead of the story. Now, maybe that's a bit of a clumsy expression, but the idea that rumors and stories and accounts will take place no matter what, and often people can be helped through all of this process by good leadership right at the beginning to kind of guide and set some direction for this, rather than letting it run away all on its own, become a circus atmosphere. And the last one, again, a little bit flippant, but the ghosts and shrines are not helpful. I'll talk some more about that in a few minutes. Let's suppose that there has been a suicide in your school, and you first get word of it however that happens, through a phone call or something, you get word that someone has died by suicide. Right away, then, there's a protocol that can kick in. Now, one thing that I'll say about this, what I'm about to lay out for you, a couple of caveats in this. I am not in any way suggesting that this should be your policy. It's not my place to tell you what your policies should be. What I'm going to lay out for you is a long-established, well-practiced plan of how these things can work, knowing that a big challenge is always to individualize this to the situation, the specific family situation, the specific school and community situations, to apply this in a way that makes sense for the individual. So it's a case-by-case kind of an application. But a few principles, I think, that help us with this. First of all, informing the school board administration, or basically what I'm saying there is that whatever your position is within the school system, whether you're a teacher, a principal, an administrator, whatever, is talk to whoever is in the next level above you. For a couple of reasons. One is because it's important for people who are in positions of accountability to know what's going on. And the other thing is that people up above us in different levels often are able to activate different kinds of helping systems that maybe we don't have access to, whether that be crisis response teams or community resources of some kind, or police or whatever. A second really important thing is to try to contact the deceased's family, and there's a number of reasons for doing that. The first and obviously the most important reason is to offer condolences and compassion to the family. And also to open up a bit of a discussion of talking with the family about what the school could do to help them to cope and to recover. But it's worth also discussing a little bit about what students should be told about the whole thing, and maybe to inquire, depending on how early on and what the timing is like, about what kind of funeral arrangements have already been thought about. Now, obviously, that's a conversation that doesn't take place right away in the first day. And one of the important things to understand and recognize is this family is almost certainly in shock and not able to think in the same kind of dispassionate way that maybe a school administrator can. And there's a really strong need at this point to balance the need of the family for privacy and dignity versus the need of the school to manage the aftermath. So this is a point of tension sometimes about how this needs to be balanced. Try to confirm the cause of death. Always good to see if you can verify the cause of death from another source besides the family, if possible. The reason for that is that families, maybe because they're in shock or maybe because of other kinds of stigmas, sometimes, in the case of a suicide, don't want to acknowledge that it's a suicide to anybody else or maybe even to themselves. And obviously that needs to be respected. It's very common, for example, that obituaries in the instance of a suicide don't mention anything about suicide. They say that the person died suddenly, or sometimes there isn't even an obituary. But if word begins to sneak out to other students somehow through social media and the grapevine or whatever, then that may become a relevant topic. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. A second set of thoughts about what to do right up front is to prepare the staff. Virtually all schools have some sort of a crisis alert system, usually a phone or email out kind of a system to let people know, some fan out system, and try to pull your staff together as early as you can, before school, for example, the following morning as soon as you find out, and begin to prepare them, because word will begin to spread with the students. You can also notify, if you have available to you some sort of a crisis response team. Often the bigger school systems have those kinds of things available to them. So that's an important thing to try to put in place as well. And then you begin to move into a second phase of putting the word out. And a couple of thoughts about that. First of all, that this is the whole idea of getting ahead of the story. If you can put the word out in a controlled way, and a proper, clear way, you maybe minimize rumors. So one of the things that generally is a good idea. First of all, is to try to talk to the students in small groups. So don't do it by an overhead announcement or a large assembly. Much better to have your teachers talk to your students, probably in homerooms or some other kind of small group clusters. You can put together a scripted statement for teachers. They could either read it directly or they could use it as a guide to speak to their students if they feel comfortable to do that. Another thing that is, in some ways is a controversial topic, but widely accepted, is to draft a letter to send it home to parents. It's done all the time. Feels a bit funny to send a letter home that says a student has died by suicide, and yet it is commonplace. I think that there's room for compassion in that, to say maybe you don't have to put the cause of death in there, but it is quite common when there's been a death, whether it's a suicide or any other kind of a death of a student, to send a message home. However that happens, whether it's on a printed form or an email or whatever, to some degree that can help minimize some of the rumors as well when parents get an official kind of a statement from the school. Now again, you want to be very compassionate with the family if the family doesn't want that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's also useful to, if you've got some materials, folders, pamphlets, anything that would help your teachers, your staff, with understanding suicide so that they can talk more effectively with their own students. And the last thing is to monitor the emotional climate of the school, just in case there might be need for some extra grief counselors or crisis responders or other sort of resources, even from outside the school. If the cause of death is not clear, it's a good thing to acknowledge that there are rumors and remind people that rumors can be very hurtful and destructive. And whatever you do, don't get into, well, there is an unconfirmed story that this happened or an unconfirmed story that that happened or whatever. Don't spread them, don't contribute to them, even if you're somehow restating them with a caveat that says this isn't confirmed yet. That's not helpful. That's probably telling you something you already know. If the family does not want the cause of death disclosed, you could try at least to let the family know that there is already talk spreading and that people are already suspecting the child died by suicide or the student died by suicide. And with compassion, gently try to persuade the family that maybe if the cause of death does become known, that might provide opportunity to talk openly about suicide, and that might help other people to deal with their grief. But if the family still does not want the cause of death disclosed, in my opinion anyway, that needs to be respected. There is a point of tension here that says that the school does not get to decide how the family tells the story and when and to whom. On the other hand, the family does not get to decide what the school will do. And so that's a difficult thing to try to balance, and it always needs to be done with a lot of care and gentleness. If possible, though, there can be some teaching as time goes by to be able to say, for instance, to students, we know that there's been a lot of talk about whether this was a suicide death. Since the subject of suicide has been raised, we want to take this opportunity to give you accurate information about suicide in general and ways to prevent it and how to get help if you or someone you know is feeling depressed or suicidal. So some sort of a general kind of a teaching opportunity about suicide without ever confirming that in this instance that was the cause of death. Following that, there is a challenge then to try to get the school or keep the school running in as steady a way as possible. So just some general sort of advice: try not to change the parameters of day-to-day life around the school any more than you need to. Try to keep the school hours the same way, that classes continue to proceed the same way, dismissals and so forth. You may need to get some help or co-opt some of the other people that are whether teachers or peripheral staff members in your school, because parents may start showing up media may start showing up to try to kind of minimize the circus atmosphere that can sometimes follow after these things. And also be particularly vigilant for other students who might be having difficulty. If you see students congregating in hallways and bathrooms, or you can maybe encourage them to talk to the counselors or other school personnel. It's important to really pay attention to looking after the people in the school setting. It's a useful exercise to follow the daily schedule of the deceased student from class to class, to notice what the people who are actually involved in a day-to-day way with that student, how they're reacting to it, and notice some of the ways that the impact is being felt, whether it's the empty desk or the lab partner or whatever, the football team practice. Make support available for teachers. A couple of suggestions about that. Teachers may want to be able to talk to some counselors themselves just to talk about how this has impacted them. It might also be useful to have some extra substitute teaching, or somebody who can cover off classes if at some point a teacher should find that things are mounting up a little bit and they need a bit of a break to cope. So that can be a useful thing as well. One good thing is to have some sort of a crisis counseling room for staff and students. I'll talk in a minute about a memorial, but sometimes there's just to be able to set aside some sort of a multi-purpose room where students can just kind of come and congregate and talk and sort out some things. And whether you have counselors in there all the time or just kind of popping in, keeping an eye on things, is that can be valuable as well. And again, try to be vigilant about any individuals who might be struggling. Family members, obviously, are people we want to pay attention to. Close friends, even teammates. It's not unusual that you would have, say a football team with a lot of players on it, where someone suicides and other players barely even know the guy, just know that he played defensive end and know what his role was on the football team, but all of a sudden that can impact them. And anybody, even people who had difficulties with the deceased, who were, kind of adversaries or whatever, or if there was any kind of bullying or anything that was going on, they can be impacted as well. And obviously anybody who witnessed the death or the close aftermath of the death. And then finally, students who you already know have struggled with depression or their own suicidality. Memorials, important topic. It's very, very common that people will want to set up a memorial. And it's important kind of principle to try to follow, treat every death the same way, whether it's a death by suicide or a death by accident or whatever else, some kind of medical condition. And the reason for that is because we really try not to glamorize, we don't want to glamorize suicide, and we don't want to glamorize the student either. So for things like, funerals, for instance, which is a kind of a memorialization, we try not to disrupt the school schedule or routine any more than possible. Obviously, you've got to allow people to go to a funeral. Nice if the family would be willing to schedule a funeral outside of school hours. That always makes things easier. And rather have the funeral or ceremonies or tributes done off school grounds, wherever possible. So we want to try to discourage them doing them in the school gymnasium or whatever, the auditorium. If funeral services are held during the school hours, allow your students and staff time away from the school to go to a community-based funeral. Good thing to try to get your students to get their parents' permission to be released from classes for the funeral, and encourage the parents to go with their children as well. But keep your school open and running, its usual schedule, and don't use your school buses to transport students. You want to kind of separate yourself symbolically from that. Now, at the same time, make sure that some of your significant staff members, administrators, counselors, whatever, prominent teachers, attend the funeral as a gesture of respect and caring for the family. Memorialization, in terms of spontaneous memorials, it's very common that students will want to, leave teddy bears and so forth somewhere, and you can save yourself some grief here, some problem. Grief's not a good word, but some problems here. If you start the process yourself by setting up something, some place, figure out a good place to have that kind of thing take place, because it's bound to happen anyway. You want to try to avoid the prominent public areas in your school. So set aside some sort of a multi-purpose room. It's common that school photographer companies that do the school photos will take the deceased student's photo, blow up a big picture for you so that you can make some sort of a tribute, put it on an easel, provide poster boards so students can write their own tributes and whatever, all with the idea that it's going to be given to the family as a gift afterwards. And the stuffed animals and whatever can be given to a charity, so that you set it in a place where it's okay and it doesn't disrupt, so that people who don't want to take part in it don't have to. They don't have to step around all this stuff on the front steps of the school. The idea of a more permanent memorial is also quite a common thing, to have something on the school grounds, a bench, a tree, a plaque. It's not really clear how much this promotes contagion, but there's some concern about it, especially if there are more than one bench or tree. Now, realistically, if you're, for instance, in a high school, the students who are actually in the school at the time when this suicide happens, they're going to cycle through within 3 or 4 years anyway, and it will be a brand new collection of students, so they won't have any first-hand experience or memory of what went on. But the bench or the tree, like a tree with a little plaque on it, is one thing, but a whole bunch of trees, like a forest, starts to deliver a different kind of message here. The message is that there's a problem in the school and people kill themselves, and that's not a good thing. So we tend not to like that. That's this sort of idea of ghosts and shrines, that we don't want to exaggerate this and glamorize this. And also, one kind of important rule of thumb is that you want to be prepared to recognize all deaths in the same way, so that you don't make a distinction and somehow give special treatment to somebody who died by suicide rather than someone who died by, for example, a medical condition. If possible, see if you can persuade the family or the community to install the memorial off of school grounds. Another popular idea that's being used more and more is to do something that's more thematic or timely, make a contribution to the school library, or set up a scholarship or a bursary, or have some sort of a fundraising event that raises money for some sort of a social agency, a charity or a fundraising, a purpose that in some way relates to the death. It's quite common that at a graduation that some brief and carefully worded statement might get made, or dedicate the yearbook to a student who died, not mentioning the suicide element, just recognizing the death. Again, it's important to treat all deaths the same. Finally, there will be places where the student's loss will be noticed within the school. So in classrooms where there's assigned seating and all of a sudden there's an empty desk, one of the things that you like to try to do is maybe redesign the desks, or redesign the design seating somehow, or the assigned seating, so that you don't end up with a constant reminder. Lab partners or whatever, shuffle things around a little bit if you can. And there is a sort of a symbolic end point for the school making these kinds of accommodations to get back to regular day-to-day life, and that often is when a funeral occurs, which presumably is something on the order of a week or week and a half or whatever of time, that you like to try to really sort of resume the regular pattern of life as soon as you can. I have drawn heavily today on this reference. I'll leave it up for the next few minutes. Have a look at it. It's excellent. And a good guide to keep. It's a PDF, so you can keep a copy of it nearby and make reference to it at any point. Let's leave it there. If anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to stick around and chat for a little longer.
Thanks, Dave. So, have people got questions or comments? The slideshow will be provided as well in the recording, and usually the Center for Suicide Prevention also provides the slide deck as a separate piece. So they'll go up later on this week or early next week, and we'll send a note out letting you know that that's been done.
In fact, this is the 9th webinar that's been done in this series, and all 9 of them are archived on the website of the Center for Suicide Prevention, so you're welcome to go back and have a look at all of them.
Any comments or questions?
Dave,
we have a... Go ahead, Dave.
A specific time period to monitor other students for. Not quite sure what you mean by that. How long do you want to keep watching in terms of weeks, I guess, or months or whatever? Hard to know how to answer that. I mean, it's so individualized. If I know that somebody's struggling, or if I see some clues that somebody's struggling, I certainly want to be watching for a while. I think you kind of get a read on what the pulse of the school is by how much people are, for example, are people still frequenting a room? If you've still got a multi-purpose room set up, are people still going there? Are people still congregating? Are people still talking about it? And then from that point on, you're starting to watch for individuals. I think for a good period of time, I certainly don't want to be stopping after a couple of weeks and say, well, it looks like everybody's fine. If there are some students that you already know tend to struggle with depression and maybe some of their own suicidality. Somebody else, Jeff has asked, what about moments of pause for school? I assume that would mean some sort of moment of silence or something in a public gathering like an assembly or whatever. I think within an early state, yes, provided that you're willing to do it with every kind of a death, that there's nothing that sort of somehow distinguishes this as a suicide being any different from any other student's death. I don't think that there's any damage being done there, and it seems like a caring, respectful kind of thing to do. Certainly in the early stages, I mean, in time, you want to get back to regular kind of daily life. So.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. I'm thinking. I don't see anybody typing. Oh, maybe there's some activity here. Oh, okay. So I'll just remind people that we will send out the link with the recording and the slideshow later on this week or early next week. Next month's webinar will be looking at what to consider after receiving notification of a suicide in your school community. And that will be, oh, I didn't look at the date. Help me out there, guys. Is it November 26th?
Whatever the last Wednesday of November is.
Yes. Okay, November 26th. So thanks, everybody. And just one other request. We will be also sending a feedback survey out. Please provide your feedback about the content today and any ideas, and even sharing what you might do with this information. It's all really important information for us in terms of informing the development of new webinars, but also to provide back to the organization that's provided the funding for this. So thank you, and good night.
Thank you, Patty.
Thanks, Dave. See you guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Goodbye.